Thanks to everyone who's joining us for this panel. Oh, we won her attendance to this panel. Awesome. Well, I hope this panel is equally as informative as some of the other panels that you've been on. We're going to be talking about reproductive freedom and how states can advance abortion rights, protect access in response to the overturning of Roe v. Wade a couple of weeks ago. My name is Tiara Mack. I'm a state senator in Rhode Island. I'm 28 years old. I am an abortion funder and a donut lover and a rugby player. And in my spare time, I also legislate in the smallest state in the US. That's a little bit about me, but I will hand it off to my panelists who will tell us a little bit more about themselves. Tell them a little bit more about themselves, and I'll start with the top corner of my screen. If Sommer, if you could start by telling me a little bit more about your role, and then how long you've been in the abortion access space, and then what intersections of abortion access do you primarily work in?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Sommer Foster. I'm the co-executive director of Michigan Voices. Michigan Voices is an affiliate of State Voices. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we coordinate and do education, engagement, activation to protect underrepresented and marginalized communities. We work to ensure full and equitable access to the democratic process. Early in 2020, we formed a reproductive justice work group with our table partners. We have 35 table partners that sit at the table, and we wanted folks to align on a vision of what reproductive justice could look like. Our reproductive justice table is anchored by organizations such as ACLU of Michigan and Planned Parenthood Advocates of Michigan. But we also have participation by groups that are not traditionally in the reproductive justice work space, but who value the issue and see that it intersects with the issues that they work on, such as gender justice, economic justice, and racial justice. We came together and really explored like what a legislative strategy could look like, what a ballot strategy could look like, and really narrowed down on a ballot strategy. So we introduced the Reproductive Freedom for All amendment to the Michigan Constitution. And so we've been working on that for the last, I want to say 8-9 months or so. We submitted signatures last week. We needed 425,000 signatures. We submitted 759,000 signatures. And so that's the lane that our work is going to take over the next few months of this year.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Sommer. And then I'll pass it off to Beulah. Same questions. Your role, how long you've been in abortion access, and then what intersections you primarily work in.
Thank you. So my name is Beulah Osueke. I'm the Deputy Director of New Voices for Reproductive Justice, an organization that's based in Pennsylvania and Ohio, dedicated to transforming society for the complete health and well-being of Black women, girls, and gender-expansive people. And currently I'm heading our community organizing efforts. So that's the lens through which I'll be speaking. I've been in the repro justice space for 3 years, but I've been in movement and in community organizing for 7 years. And I want to make clear that reproductive justice is a comprehensive framework that looks at the access to quality care that all people receive, primarily, again, like I said, Black women, girls, and gender-expansive people. So it's not just about abortion access as a component of what we do, but reproductive justice as a whole. Our organizational issue focuses on chronic justice, Black maternal health, and gender-based violence, whether it's intimate partner violence or state-sanctioned violence. And the ways in which we address that is through community organizing, policy advocacy, voter engagement, as well as mutual aid. And so that is what I'm bringing to this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Tresa, you're up next. Your role, how long you've been in abortion access, and the intersections of your work.
Sure. So my name is Tresa Undem, she, her pronouns. I'm a partner at PerryUndem, and we're a small public opinion research firm based in DC. And I've been studying public opinion for about 20 years, about 15 years of that. I've been, constantly in the field on the topic of abortion, and both in terms of, narrowly on abortion rights, also on healthcare, related reproductive healthcare, and then also around reproductive justice for various RJ groups. And so I've been studying this issue for a long time, and everything from various restrictions back in the day, when they started really ramping up and, admitting privileges and all of that, all up until, the decision a couple of weeks ago. We were in the field. We've been tracking public opinion data, all through this year at various points, and we will be through this year. And a lot has changed. And I'll just say, on this topic and topics related to it, everything I knew about public opinion 10 years ago related to abortion is no longer, it was either wrong what I knew, or it's no longer true. There's been really huge shifts, even though the media narrative and what we think we know about abortion hasn't yet caught up with actual reality in terms of how people feel and think.
Let's dive a little bit more into that. So I am a state legislator in Rhode Island, and I've been involved in the abortion access space in Rhode Island for almost a decade now. And so I've also seen that landscape shift and change. But one of the things that I have noticed, and I'll ask each of you next, is that there are lots of nefarious and insidious laws that restrict a person's authentic access to choice when it comes to being able to choose an abortion. In Rhode Island specifically, we're a blue state, and it wasn't until the overturning of Roe v. Wade that many people knew that we had laws like parental consent for folks who are under the age of 18. We also in Rhode Island restrict any state employees from having abortion covered under their health insurance, which is about 17,000 Rhode Islanders. And we also prevent state funds from covering abortion through our Medicaid program, which is about 330,000 people. Rhode Island is a very small state, so we have about 1.1 million people. So 330,000 people plus another 17 is about 1/3 of Rhode Islanders who do not have access, who do not have abortion covered under their health insurance, meaning that they have to either pay out of pocket or not receive the care that they need. What are some other, and I'll do the opposite direction, and then Tresa, I'll have a separate question for you on public opinion. But Beulah, what are some of the kind of insidious or nefarious rules or legislation that you've encountered that directly impact Black maternal health, access to choice, and Black gender expansive people in the areas that you serve? Oh, and you're muted.
I have never done that in a Zoom, and now I just did it in front of like 70 people. But thank you for that question. So first, I want to have a conversation about access, because a lot of people are talking about the legality of abortion, not recognizing, or there is maybe a recognition, but just not enough of recognition about the barriers that people have to jump through in order to gain access to abortion care to begin with. I wanted to point out, in response to this question, HB 704 in Ohio, that states that life begins at conception, and the bill paves the way for a total abortion ban in the state, with no exception for rape and no exception for incest. I actually learned, I think a month ago, that the bill's sponsor said that when questioned about rape, especially for a child, said that would be an opportunity for that child. And in addition to no exception for rape or incest, there's potentially a ban for IVF and certain forms of contraception due to a clause saying that personhood begins at conception. So that's in Ohio. And then in Pennsylvania, SB 106, which states that there's no constitutional right to an abortion in the state, recently passed the House of Representatives, and it's now moved on to the next level. But this bill proposes an amendment to the PA state constitution that states there is no right in the state of Pennsylvania, and that taxpayer money cannot be used to fund abortion care, which opens the way for criminalization. So those are the two that I would highlight: SB 106 in Pennsylvania and HB 704 in Ohio.
Thank you. And Sommer.
Sure, thank you. So in Michigan, we have a ban on abortion on the books. It's a criminal ban from 1931 that says that anyone who is guilty of helping to provide an abortion would be at risk for 15 years in prison. And so that's one of the things that we are fighting against in Michigan. Before Roe was struck down, most people in Michigan didn't even know that it existed. It's from 1931. Our Planned Parenthood Advocates of Michigan filed a lawsuit to, challenge the constitutionality of the 1931 law. And so right now there's a temporary injunction in place on the law, so it's not currently active. But we've had 2 prosecutors in the state of Michigan that said that the injunction does not apply to them, that they are able to prosecute under the 1931 law. And so that is something that we are deeply concerned about, that overturning Roe with these trigger bans in a number of states just cause a bunch of confusion, and patients don't know if it's legal for them to seek care or where they can go. So we are trying to help them navigate that system right now. One of the other things that I do want to mention is that anytime that you put something at risk for criminalization, it deeply impacts Black and Brown people. And so even though this law is directed at providers, we know that it'll impact Black and Brown people, it'll impact people in our communities. It will also impact those who choose to do self-abortion through medication. And so that's something we feel it's important to educate our communities about as well, and the importance of passing the Reproductive Freedom for All Amendment.
Thanks for highlighting some of that. It sounds like there's a lot of similar tactics that many people who are on the opposite, who are trying to restrict human rights, are using the same tactics in multiple states. I've heard of several pieces of legislation that mirror what both of y'all have mentioned. And Tresa, I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, that public opinion in the last 10 years has shifted. Can you explain a little bit about the trends that you've seen in the last 10 years and what the shift that you have perceived has been?
Yeah, so there's all these they're myths right now where it's still conventional wisdom, but it's no longer true. For example, I think we all think, oh, abortion is really a Republican issue. It's something that really mobilizes Republicans. Actually, in the past several years, I would say post Trump, post 2016, Democrats are actually more unified on this issue than Republicans. The issue is, prior to this year, most people thought that abortion access, existed, was available, even though it was incredibly restricted. They thought it was available, and most of their candidates are pro-choice. So is this, when you see exit polls, is this the top issue for Democrats? It hasn't been. But that's because they have generally pro-choice candidates, and they think it exists, right? Access exists. Whereas Republicans on exit polls, they've been fighting against something, so that's why. But generally, Democrats are way more united, and vast majority of Democrats more likely to vote for a pro-choice candidate. And independents, by the way, twice as likely to vote for a pro-choice candidate. And Republicans are more mixed. About half, a little more than half, more likely to vote for an anti-abortion candidate. The other half either don't care or pro-choice candidate. All right, so that's one myth. This has actually become more of a Democratic issue. The other thing that's changed is among Latino voters, Latinx voters. It used to be for a decade that, first of all, I think there's this narrative out there that Latino voters are more anti-abortion. They are not, and they haven't been for 12 years I've been studying it. Latino voters have mirrored sort of white voters in every poll that we've done. Now, in the past, just in the past year, I'm seeing Latino voters actually jump and become more pro-choice than white voters. So Latino voters are looking more like other voters of color. Black voters, there's also been a myth like, oh, Black voters are more religious, therefore they're more anti-abortion. No, Black voters are actually the most progressive on abortion access. And they, by the way, here's another myth. We think that, this is this is a religious issue that a lot of people struggle with. No, for 77% of voters, this is not a religious issue, including for Black voters, including for Latino voters. Majority abortion is not a religious issue, and a majority of voters don't struggle with their views on this issue. It's not like people are mired in it. And so that's something that's a myth as well. And I think one other thing that's changed is stigma on this issue. It used to be, 10, 15 years ago, I'd do focus groups on abortion, and, it'd be a tough topic, and somebody would, I'd have to have a Kleenex box on the table because someone might disclose they had an abortion, and then the room would get silent and everybody would thank the person for sharing. And now it's just like, oh, when I have my abortion, blah, 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 blah. There's just not as much stigma. 68% of voters think there should be less shame and stigma around abortion. So this is an issue that can be talked about, should be talked about directly using the word abortion. It's just really changed. And then the last thing I'll say is just kind of like something we'd have incomplete in our thinking about public opinion. This issue is about babies when life begins, but what's not focused on enough is this issue is about your views toward women and power. For example, 82% of pro-choice voters agree that the country would be better off with more women in office. So 82% of pro-choice voters feel that. Only 34% of anti-abortion voters think the country would be better off with more women in office. 71% of pro-choice voters feel favorable of the Me Too movement. Only 23% of anti-abortion voters feel favorable of the Me Too movement. So it's very connected with gender, also with race, power. So I'll probably stop there, but those are kind of the big things that have shifted and the things that the media narrative has not really caught up with yet.
Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like I've noticed that same trend that in the most recent years, I've been an abortion funder since 2015. I've been working for organizations that explicitly have abortion as part of their mission and access to abortion as part of their mission. But in the most recent years, the thing that I have found to be the most especially in the most recent months, many people who've been involved in abortion access rights and bodily autonomy conversations, especially for the most marginalized communities, have really been trying to raise the red flag for years, especially when it comes to the gaps that exist when talking about abortion, the resources that exist when engaging community members around the topics of conversation. In Rhode Island, I have found that the biggest gap is education. Most folks don't know what is and is not legal. They don't know who is pro-choice and who is kind of just passive on the issue and who the champions of most bills are. What have you all noticed in your respective states or in your work to be the biggest gap for folks who are kind of caught off guard by the overturning of Roe v. Wade when it comes to next steps in understanding the climate in their states? And I'll start with you, Sommer.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that we are struggling with in Michigan is that nobody knew that the 1931 law existed. No one knew that we had TREP laws in place for parental notification and, things like that. And so it is really a statewide education and outreach program to let folks know what the barriers are, that we have the temporary injunction in place. And I keep saying this over and over again, because I don't want people in Michigan to think that they're unable to access care. And so that is really important from our perspective. But also that they, when Roe was overturned, they thought that we launched the ballot initiative that day or, leading up to that with the leak. And so we were very much like, no, this has been happening for months. There is hope. You can get involved. We do need you to sign this petition. We do need you to volunteer for the campaign. But I think people just didn't take the risks to Roe very seriously. They thought that it was something that was going to be around forever. And they thought that it was something that, politicians just campaigned on every few years or so. But it really wasn't going away. And so I think it is our duty to let folks know that, yes, it is at risk. There are other things at risk, like access to contraception, and we do need to do what we can to protect that as well. One of the things that I'm really proud about our ballot initiative is that it's broad. It includes maternal care, it includes abortion, it includes contraception, it includes sterilization if necessary. People should be able to make their own decisions on that. And so for us, that's what the education looks like.
Yeah, Beulah.
Yeah, I would say the biggest gap I feel is monetary support for mobilization efforts and providing direct funding and resources allocated to the direct needs of local communities. And so a lot of times I hear a push for education, but it doesn't matter what you're trying to teach me if I'm hungry, if I cannot eat, which is why organization New Voices marries providing resources and providing mutual aid to our community members in addition to the leadership efforts and educational efforts that we offer. So when you asked about what next steps can be provided, one, we can create concrete projects and educational tools that aid our community members in their learning, in their entry to reproductive justice, yes, as well as what we provide to elected officials. But again, without that recognition that there has to be direct resources that are offered directly to people, not given to organizations to then facilitate that allocation of needs, the gaps are going to continue, the gaps are going to widen. Also, there is very intentional disinformation campaigns. We talked about myths, we talked about misconceptions. Those things don't come out of nowhere. So there is narrative work that is being done by the quote unquote ops, opposition, whatever you want to call them, to intentionally insert inaccurate information, fear amongst our communities. So we have to take seriously narrative. We have to take seriously what contributes to the actions that we are now seeing. I'm of the belief that thoughts lead to beliefs, and beliefs lead to words, words lead to action. And then from that action, we have policy, we have cultural impact. So if we intervene as early as we can, right? When we hear narratives that are intentionally looking to undermine people power, that are intentionally looking to undermine our movements, and work against that, and work within our communities to really make sure that we're proliferating affirming messaging, that's also highly important. I think Tresa was talking about perception versus reality, like that's something that is very, very intentional. And then lastly, what I would say, and this is I think a core principle of reproductive justice as a movement, but also as a practice, actively combating restrictive thinking about what is possible. Many of us do very serious work, but the work that we do does not just require our brains, but also our hearts, our minds, all of us. So as I have mentioned at least 3 times, now this might be the 4th, reproductive justice is a comprehensive framework that recognizes that if we don't engage with pleasure and play, then we're not going to be able to fully utilize our individual and our collective genius. And so I would really encourage people to engage in exercises and create spaces for movement leaders, for elected officials to build community, to exercise our imaginations, and truly take seriously dedicating space and not just combating all these isms that we're talking about, but also to imagining what a world can and should look like when we remove ourselves from the poverty of imagination and think about what can and should be for future generations.
Yes, that is really powerful, Beulah. As someone who recently went viral for twerking to get my message out online, I think it is unfortunate that the opposition has tried to take away our joy, our livelihood, and our liberation. But especially folks who've been on the ground, who've been in movement spaces, who know that joy and pleasure are at the center of a liberated future, and is one of the frameworks that we can use in order to imagine a new and bold world of the future. It's super important that we engage in play and that we engage our communities. I also like hearing the cross sections of the work that we have to do. Reproductive justice is all about an unsiloed approach to all of the ways that we can treat a whole person and a whole community. It's not about one versus the other. It's knowing that we have to work on every single facet of someone's life in order to create communities that are sustainable. Yes, we are twerking for justice, Crystal. I'm twerking for a lot of things on my social media, making all of the alt-right mad. And Tresa, there were a couple more questions for you in the chat, and I see a couple of folks. What are some of the messages that pro-abortion and like adamant abortion candidates, not just pro-choice? I encourage everyone who is on this chat and watching this to like firmly and adamantly say the word abortion and not just choice, because that is one of the tools that the opposition has tried to use. It's not about choice; it's about body autonomy and it's about access to abortion. What are some of the messages, Tresa, that you have found to be effective on the doors and amongst Democratic pollers?
Yeah, so I would say I totally agree with you. People see this as about bodily autonomy, and right now, I've seen this for about 5 or so years. It used to be that abortion was about having choice. It was about safety. It was about health. Right now, it is about power and control. It's about who has power, who's taking it away, who's losing it, who has control over your body, over my body, who's making those decisions. It comes up in every focus group and every study. So I think keep that in mind, like it's who has power over my body and over these decisions. And so a positive framing would be, something about everybody should have the power to control their own body, their personal decisions, their life's path. Donna, it's not so much about privacy. I mean, I know obviously that's part of the Roe decision, but I would say that that's not so much. It used to be, 10, 15 years ago, yes, this is a really private decision, but I think with the shift in stigma and all of that, it's more, I think that's less helpful. And I think it's not quite where people are. Again, people are like, who's making these decisions? These are mostly men passing these laws. Yes, there are women, but that's voters saying this is mostly men. Why aren't they regulating men's bodies? This is about white supremacy. I mean, people are starting to like make all these connections. And again, it's really about power and control. So I think that's a positive frame. I think Murray also in Minnesota, and just to go back to what Sommer was saying, I think we did a survey a couple of years in Minnesota, and it was something like 97% of voters could not name one correct restriction in the state. You think Minnesota is a blue state, and other states, every state has restrictions on this issue. It is really restricted, even in the most, even in a lot of blue states. In Minnesota, just because I know you're there, Stuart, the Supreme Court ruled I think it was 1995 that the government may not put its thumb on the scale in favor of one pregnancy outcome, like carrying a pregnancy to term, over another, like abortion. And that language in Minnesota was really, we kind of tested that language, and 70% of people agree with that. Yeah, the government should be, involved in that. And I think that, wherever you are, whatever state you are, I think that sentiment of, people should be able to make their own decisions without the government interfering. That's just something that is pretty positive and pretty safe to use across the board.
Yes, thank you. I know we're running down on time. We have about 2 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get some closing statements from all of our panelists. It's exciting to have these conversations. I think more people now, as I see the tactics of folks on the right who are literally trying to take away bodily autonomy, not just for women and gender expansive folks, but also for our trans community, for our Black and Brown community members, and for our immigrant community. This is just the beginning, and the overturning of Roe was just a beginning of the opposition trying to wield power over other people's body to create a society that is more compliant to white supremacy than we've seen ever before in U.S. history. So I want to just leave folks with some final statements. Definitely check out what is happening in your state. Most states are not a blue state. Guttmacher, which was just linked, has some really great resources to check out what is actually happening in your states. But I will yield the rest of my time to my panelists to give a final 30-second closing remarks on what is going on in their state and uplift any community orgs or resources that you think would be helpful. And I will start with Sommer.
Thank you. I will just say really quickly that the roadmap that our opposition is using is the same or very similar in every state. And I think that we need to have a united front to fight against what they're trying to do in our communities. And right now it's abortion, but next it's going to be gay rights. Next it's going to be attacking the right to interracial marriages or whatever Clarence Thomas said in his opinion. But I really hope that people will look at direct democracy in ways to fight against some of the prohibitions that our opposition is putting into states, and look at using the ballot initiative process. And I hope through doing this in Michigan, and I know that there's something coming up in Kansas in a couple of weeks, that folks will look at that model and do what they can to make sure that folks have the legal right to abortion in their states.
Beulah, you're up next.
Thank you. I just want to leave by sharing that voting is a tool, not the tool. And I believe that community is a necessary foundation. And in moments like this, we are not shocked, we're not surprised. We're looking at the trajectory of this country, the origin of this country, and knowing that community is a necessary foundation to our survival. When the needs of the most marginalized are met, all people's needs are met. Poor people, Black people, women, gender expensive people, queer people are some of the most innovative people in existence out of necessity. So I really want to encourage people beyond this kind of a space to proactively engage with the leaders in your spaces, reproductive justice leaders, Black feminist leaders. This genius is existing all around. It's just that in moments of emergencies, when people are tapped on, we should be tapped on at all times. Thank you.
Two things. One, I think voters really need leaders right now. And to say, as the administration has said, we just need more you to vote. No, voters are like, wait a second, this is your job, fighting abortion rights. I did vote, right? So voters are really looking for bold leaders who are actually doing something and communicating that they're doing something. The second thing I would just say is that there are states do have laws on the books, and I'm not an expert on this, but on like equal rights. I think some states have equal rights laws, but they're not being enforced. So this is another strategy that, look into in your state, what equal protections do you have in that state, and how can that be used as a way to help protect and expand abortion access?
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. We are at our time limit. Thanks for the folks who stayed at 2 minutes over. I believe this will be recorded, but thank you all so much for joining, and I hope this was helpful. And thanks to all my panelists as well.